This is the second of our two videos on stress in English. Most languages in the world don't use extra effort on the part of the respiratory system in order to make syllables more prominent in the stream of speech. For routinely prominent syllables, they use other mechanisms, but they don't use the pushes with the abdominal muscles that I was talking about in the previous video. So if your students don't have this as part of their L1, they're going to have to consciously get back in contact with the actions of their respiratory system in order to make these gestures in the way that native speakers do them, so that ultimately this process can become automatic. In this week's video, we've got a series of exercises and activities which will help them to do that. For the first set of exercises, we're going to be using fricative sounds. Now, fricatives are useful because you can prolong them for several seconds, and so it's easier to pay attention to what's going on with various parts of your mouth, and in this case, your respiratory system, while you're making these sounds. And what we want you to do in all of these exercises is to ignore the sound itself, to ignore what you're doing with your mouth, what's happening with your tongue while you're making the sound, but instead pay attention to what's happening at the level of your respiratory system. What are you doing with your abdominal muscles? What's happening to your belly as you make these various sounds? And to compare and contrast one sound with another and to see what the differences and similarities are. So, in the first exercise, just take a soft S, a soft S sound, a soft S, and a loud S. Obviously there's going to be a difference in the sound each is making, but see what's happening with your respiratory system as you make a soft S and a loud S. And then work with the voiced version of S, Z, and do the same exercise and compare and contrast the two experiences. Then move on to comparing the voiceless with the voice. So compare the soft S with a soft Z and a loud S with a loud Z sound. And see what's happening. How is your belly shape changing? How is the speed at which your belly contracting differing between voiced and voiceless, one sound and another sound? If you start asking yourself these questions and paying attention to what's going on, you'll start to get a sense of what your respiratory system is actually doing as you create sounds. And then take another pair of fricatives, in this case F and V, and go through the same set of exercises again. How does the effort involved in making each of these two different sounds compare? And what about when one of them is loud and one of them is soft? What about the length of time that you can prolong, say, an F versus a V? If you just indefinitely say an F, at what point do you run out of breath? Similarly, if you indefinitely say a V, at what point do you run out of breath? Is it the same? Is it different? Ask yourself the question, why would there be a difference? If you do find a difference, why would there be a difference in the length of time in which I can actually say these two sounds? Asking yourself all of these questions will help to sensitize you to what's going on with your respiratory system, your breathing apparatus, while you're making sounds. In the classroom, we use the word snort to mean the opposite of the word sniff. So to sniff is to pull air into yourself through your nose very sharply. We use snorting to mean exactly the opposite, to be pushing air out through your nose in a very sharp way. Snorting is quite a useful thing to do because it puts us in touch with what the cause and effect relationship is between the actions of our abdominal muscles and the air flowing through our bodies, through our vocal tract. The whole point about making an action automatic is that the intention alone will then trigger the action. So when we have the intention to snort, it's very easy for that to be triggered directly, and for when we pay attention to what's going on with our respiratory systems, for us to imagine that somehow the flow of air out of our noses is causing our bellies to contract. Now, of course, that's not the right relationship of cause and effect. It's the fact that we're pushing inwards with our abdominal muscles, which is squeezing our belly contents, which is squeezing the diaphragm upwards, which is pushing air out of the top and causing airflow at the nose. But it's worth just going through the motions of snorting a few times, just checking that you're very clear about the fact that it's the action with your respiratory muscles, a conscious action with your respiratory muscles, that is causing the air to flow. And then once you've got this sorted out for snorting, you can do the same things with your mouth open, so the air going through your mouth rather than your nose. And if you imagine, for example, blowing a candle out, then again, make sure you get the right cause and effect relationship between the actions of your abdominal muscles and the airflow which is coming out as you pretend to blow a candle out. Here are two sentences. One has three H's in it, one has three B's in it. Now, H is an interesting segment because it's a high airflow segment. In the technical terms, H is actually a breathy onset to the vowel which follows it. So in terms of how the noise is created, it's created by the rush of air through your mouth and frication and turbulence in the mouth as a result of that. But to make the sound associated with H, a lot of airflow is required. So H is a high airflow segment, B is a low airflow segment. So if you make these two sentences and pay attention to what's going on with your respiratory system, with your abdominal muscles when you make them, you may well be able to feel there's a difference between the two. And then when you've done it in normal voice, try saying the sentences, whispering the sentences. Again, whisper requires a lot more airflow than normal speech. So I suspect you'll find quite a difference in what your abdominal muscles are doing when they whisper the first of these sentences and they whisper the second of these sentences. One thing which you may well have noticed by now is that it's really quite difficult to be aware of the actions of your respiratory system when you're speaking normally. We've been doing these exercises to try to make you more sensitive, to try to help you to become more aware of what's going on there. But when we're speaking normally, we're very largely unaware of what's going on with our respiratory systems, in the same way as we're very unaware of what's going on with our tongues, our lips, our jaws, etc. We've spent tens of thousands of hours of our lives speaking. We're Olympic athletes in terms of throwing our tongues around our mouths and getting exactly the result we want as a result of doing that. So it's not surprising that it's difficult to re-enter a skill that has been so over-practiced, but has been made so automatic as a result of so many years of use. There's another reason why it's difficult to get ourselves back in touch with what our speech-breathing apparatus is doing. That's illustrated by the diagrams two below. One is obviously the one on the right is just an expansion of the one on the left. What you can see there is a scale showing the sort of pressures that we can generate with our respiratory system apparatus. The scale goes upwards to the sort of activities like blowing glass or playing a trumpet very loudly, and it goes downwards from the 0 level for when we're creating negative pressures and sucking air inside into our bodies, when we're inspiring, but when we're doing some sort of very strong active inspiration down at the bottom. So this is a scale going from the maximum expiration at the top, maximum expiratory pressures at the top, maximum inspiratory pressures at the bottom. And what you can see in the enlarged section on the right is that conversational speech hardly strains the respiratory system at all. Compared to what it's capable of generating, the pressures it's capable of generating, normal speech is pretty much effortless. So the sort of actions which an adult makes in order to create the flows of air in speech, they're pretty much imperceptible to that adult because the system is it's almost idling along. Here we've got a machine which can generate huge pressures for blowing glass, and to actually blow the vocal folds apart and create a noise through our vocal folds is trivial in comparison to that kind of a task. Now that said, interestingly, when children are learning to speak, they have to work very much harder. The aerodynamics, the physiology, all sorts of other aspects of children are very different from adults, and they speak on much higher pressures than adults do. And so the work of speech breathing is much more apparent to them. And in particular, a child speaking, as you may well have noticed, sometimes children just run out of air. Another difference between children and adults is that children have a much lower air volumes. Sometimes they're speaking and they just run out of air completely. Anyway, for children, the sort of pushes that have to be made for stress syllables in English are much more apparent than they are for adults. And of course, native speakers learn to speak as children. And what we need to do as adults is get back in contact with those learner movements. And what our students need to do is to get back in contact with those learner movements, establish conscious control over them, and then make them automatic once we've mastered the art of speech breathing for English. Well, we can't all become children again, and nor can our students become small children again. So what are we going to do to recreate the experience for them of speech breathing as a child would learn it? Well, one thing we can do is to get them to speak with different modes of production. So normal voice hardly strains the respiratory system at all. But you'll all be aware that when you whisper, it's a lot more effortful. A lot more energy is required from the respiratory system to speak in a whisper than to speak in normal voice. And there's a further level if one starts using so-called stage whisper or loud whisper. In stage whisper, an actor on the stage has to whisper something, but it has to be audible right at the back of the auditorium. So it's a type of whisper that's actually very loud. And it requires a lot of speech breathing activity, a lot of respiratory system effort to create a loud whisper or a stage whisper. So we can use this tool to get into the experience of how it would be to speak as a child, how it would be to learn English at a stage when respiratory systems, the actions of the respiratory system, are very apparent and very much part of the production process. Here's one way that we can go about making use of this. In the diagram, you've got a cycle between normal voice, whisper, and stage whisper. And what we suggest to our students, and what you might like to experiment for yourself, is to take a sentence or a phrase and say it first of all in a normal voice, and then to say it in a whisper, but paying attention to what you're doing with your abdominal muscles when you do that. Then go on and say it in a loud whisper, and again pay careful attention to the exact actions you make, particularly on the stresses, of course, with your abdominal musculature. Finally, go back to saying it in normal voice, but this time use exactly the same actions, consciously repeat exactly the same actions with your abdominal muscles to the same degree when you're speaking in normal voice. And what does the result sound like? We often do this when we do this exercise. For the loud whisper part of it, we often send our students to the back of the class or even outside the classroom to force them to really exert their respiratory systems so that the gestures which they're making are very, very apparent to them. Then they come back, they say it in a normal voice, and well, perhaps you'd like to share with us on the Google Plus community what your experience of this is. Does the final result, when you're using very exaggerated motions of your abdominal muscles to produce the stresses, does the final result come out sounding like normal English? Does it sound very strained? Does it sound very odd? Or does it sound very normal? Tell us about it in the Google Plus community. Let me finish just by mentioning two other reasons why we think that an articulatory approach to teaching pronunciation is superior to a listen and repeat type paradigm. The first is that we want our students to be speaking in an authentic and a healthy way. We've come across students who, when they speak English, are clearly uncomfortable just from a physical point of view. When they're speaking their own language, they're fluent and they're relaxed. When they're speaking English, there's obviously strains and tensions in their voices and their bodies. So we want to teach the authentic actions that underlie stress and other aspects of English, so that when people are speaking English, they're as free in that language as they are in their first language. And the second reason for taking an articulatory approach is that you can take it out of the classroom more easily. If you're learning in a listen and repeat type paradigm, then you need a model to be present in order to copy the model. If, on the other hand, you're learning the actions that underlie the various aspects of English pronunciation, then once you have criteria for whether the actions you make are right or wrong, you can take it away, you can take those criteria with you out of the classroom, and you can practice anywhere you like and know whether you're doing the right thing or you're not doing the right thing.